They sold nearly 5 million copies of a single song. They became the first British invasion band to hit #1 in America without the Beatles. They filled stadiums across 2 continents and defined the sound of working-class rebellion in the 1960s. Then a 4-minute folk song destroyed them from the inside. One member walked away with all the royalties while the rest got nothing. The band went from selling millions to fighting over who even owned their name. Members couldn't stand to be in the same room together. They lost everything overnight. Money vanished into offshore bank accounts that didn't exist. Yakuza gangsters held them at gunpoint in Japan, and decades later, they were still at war over a song none of them actually wrote. This is the story of how success became a poison pill. How a band born from the coal mines and shipyards of northern England conquered the world, only to have that victory rip them apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but bitterness, lawsuits, and a legacy they'd spend 50 years fighting over. A tale of brotherhood wrecked by greed, management theft, and one catastrophic decision about a record label. But to understand the collapse, we have to go back to Newcastle-upon-Tyne, 1962, where 5 working-class kids were about to accidentally create one of the most iconic songs in rock history and sign away their futures in the process. Newcastle-upon-Tyne in the early 1960s wasn't a place where rock dreams came true. It was a port city, a coal mining hub in northeast England where survival mattered more than stardom. The docks were harsh, the winters brutal, and rock and roll wasn't an escape. It was just another hustle. That's where the Animals were born. The band started as the Alan Price Rhythm and Blues Combo back in 1958, playing sweaty club gigs to dockworkers and miners who wanted American blues translated through a British working-class lens. They weren't polished. They weren't pretty. They were raw, earthy, and real. In 1962, a young singer named Eric Burdon joined the group, and everything changed. Burdon was the voice, gritty, soulful, with a howl that could cut through cigarette smoke and bar fights. Alan Price was the craftsman, the keyboardist whose organ sound would become their signature. Hilton Valentine was the quiet guitar genius. Chas Chandler, the bass player, was the steady engine. And John Steele kept time on drums like a factory worker punching a clock. Together, they became the Animals. Their sound was different. They took American blues and R&B songs by Lead Belly, John Lee Hooker, and forgotten folk ballads, and rebuilt them with British grit and organ-driven intensity. Where other British invasion bands chased pop perfection, the Animals dragged the blues through the coal dust of Newcastle and made it dangerous again. What made them special wasn't technical wizardry. It was authenticity. Fans latched onto them because they sounded like they'd lived hard lives, because they reflected the struggle and exhaustion of working-class Britain. Critics didn't always get it. The industry didn't know what to do with them. But the kids in the clubs? They understood. Their first break came in 1963 when Mike Jeffrey, owner of the club Go in Newcastle, became their manager. Jeffrey saw potential and profit. He convinced the band to record a demo EP, pressing 500 copies to sell to fans. That demo somehow made its way to London, into the hands of producer Mickey Most, a hitmaker with a reputation for turning raw talent into chart gold. Most saw the magic immediately. In early 1964, he brought them to London, signed them to EMI Records, and put them in D. Lane Leah Studio. On February 12, 1964, they recorded their first official single, Baby Let Me Take You Home. It was a modest hit, but it was enough. The Animals were now part of the British invasion, the tidal wave of UK bands flooding America in the wake of the Beatles. They toured with Chuck Berry and the Swinging Blue Jeans. They played Japan. They were moving fast, too fast to notice the trap being set. Because even in the beginning, the seeds of destruction were already there. Mike Jeffrey wasn't just a manager, he was a manipulator, a man who would later be accused of theft, embezzlement, and running money through shadowy offshore accounts. Mickey Most, for all his production genius, had creative control the band didn't want. They were being packaged, shaped, and sold as a product, not as artists. And then there was the money. The band was about to record the biggest hit of their lives, a song that would sell 5 million copies worldwide, a song that would define them forever. But they had no idea that only one of them would ever see a dime from it. The fault line was cracked. They just didn't know it yet. May 18, 1964. D. Lane Leah Studio, London. The Animals walked into the session with a song they'd been playing live for months, a traditional folk ballad called House of the Rising Sun. It was an old tune, passed down through generations, about a life destroyed in New Orleans. Lead Belly had recorded a version. Bob Dylan had played it. But nobody had ever heard it like this. They recorded it in one take. 4 minutes and 40 seconds. No second chances. Just raw performance. Burdon's voice aching with despair, Price's organ swirling like a church hymn from hell, Valentine's guitar arpeggios echoing like footsteps down a dark hallway. The song was played in 6/8 meter, a waltz time that made it feel haunting, hypnotic, inevitable. It was over 4 minutes long, extraordinarily long for a single in 1964. Radio stations didn't play songs that long. But Mickey Most fought for it, and the label released it anyway. It exploded. House of the Rising Sun topped the UK singles chart in July 1964. On September 5, 1964, it hit number 1 in the United States, staying there for 3 weeks. It became the first British invasion number 1 hit unconnected with the Beatles. It sold nearly 5 million copies worldwide. At the time, it was the longest-running song to ever top the charts. Critics called it the first folk rock hit. Fans called it a masterpiece. The Animals were suddenly global superstars. But beneath this triumph, something dark was growing. The songwriting credit for House of the Rising Sun listed only one name, Alan Price. The band was told that all 5 names wouldn't fit on the 45 revolutions per minute label, so only the arranger's name, Price, was printed. It seemed like a minor administrative detail at the time. It wasn't. Because of that credit, only Alan Price received songwriter royalties. Every time the song played on the radio, every time a copy sold, the money went to him. Not to Burdon, whose voice made the song immortal. Not to Valentine, whose guitar line became iconic. Not to Chandler or Steele, who held down the rhythm. Just Price. The rest of the band got session fees. Price got rich. What fans didn't see was the resentment building behind the smiles. The Animals kept rising. Their debut album, also called The Animals, was released in September 1964 and hit number 6 in the UK, number 7 in the US Billboard 200. It spent 27 weeks on the American charts, peaking at number 7 on the top LPs chart. They were outselling legends. But the real cost was building quietly. Mickie Most was feeding them songs from brill-building songwriters, professional hitmakers like Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. The songs were great. The band hated it. Burdon, especially, felt creatively strangled. They were working-class blues rebels being turned into a pop machine. They wanted to write their own material, control their own sound. Most wouldn't let them. And that's where the trouble began. In 1965, they released We Gotta Get Out of This Place, another Man-Weil song. It was perfect, an anthem of working-class desperation that spoke directly to their fans. It hit number 2 in the UK, held out of the top spot by the Beatles' Help. In the US, it reached number 13. More importantly, it became the unofficial anthem of American soldiers in Vietnam. GIs played it obsessively, a soundtrack to their own desperation to escape the war. Decades later, it would be inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame and ranked number 233 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. The Animals were now one of the biggest bands in the world. They had 10 top 20 hits in both the UK and the US. They were filling stadiums. They were defining an era. But beneath this triumph, the band was fracturing. Mike Jeffries' financial management was becoming a nightmare. The band was making millions, but they never saw the money. Later, they would accuse Jeffrey of theft, embezzlement, and running funds through fake offshore accounts. Mickie Most's creative control was suffocating them. The constant touring, Japan, the UK, the US, over and over, was grinding them down. And Alan Price? He was the only one getting royalty checks from their biggest hit. The real cost was building quietly. And in May 1965, the first piece fell. Alan Price quit. In May 1965, at the height of the Animals' fame, their keyboardist and founding member walked away. The official reason was fear of flying and the exhaustion of non-stop touring. The real reason, according to the rest of the band, was money. Chas Chandler would later say, with bitter sarcasm, he must have got his first royalty check. Price left while holding all the songwriting royalty proceeds from House of the Rising Sun, a fortune that would keep growing for decades while the rest of the band got nothing. In 2009, surviving members would still express harsh judgment over Price's departure, calling it betrayal. Price went on to form the Alan Price Set, a successful band that even recorded some of Randy Newman's first songs. He had a solo career, wealth, and freedom. The Animals, meanwhile, had to replace him. Mick Gallagher stepped in temporarily, then Dave Roberry, formerly of the Mike Cotton Sound, became their permanent keyboardist. The band tried to keep moving, but the magic was different now. Roberry was talented, but he wasn't one of the originals. The brotherhood was broken. And the financial nightmare was getting worse. In 1965, Mike Jeffrey and Mickie Most lost a court case. Two property developers claimed they'd financed the Animals early on and were owed proceeds from House of the Rising Sun. The case drained resources and exposed how tangled the band's business affairs had become. Jeffrey negotiated new contracts, £100,000 from Decca, £90,000 from MGM in the US. Massive sums for 1965. The Animals would receive only a tiny fraction of it. Jeffrey kept the rest, funneling money into accounts the band couldn't trace. In February 1966, drummer John Steele left. He was replaced by Barry Jenkins, another outsider. Now, of the original 5 members, only Burdon and Chandler remained. The band released Don't Bring Me Down in late 1966, their last hit as The Animals. The next single, C.C. Rider, was credited to Eric Burdon and The Animals, a signal that the band as they'd known it was over. But that moment of glory was also the beginning of the end. Because while they looked unstoppable on stage, everything off stage was cracking. Burdon was getting heavily involved in drugs, LSD, weed, the full 1960s psychedelic experience. The other members weren't. The lifestyle split was becoming a chasm. In October 1965, they recorded It's My Life, a song that felt like a mission statement, angry, defiant, desperate for control. It marked the end of the Mickey Most contract. They thought they were finally free. They weren't. By September 1966, the original incarnation of the Animals had officially split up. According to Chas Chandler, their business affairs were in a total shambles. When the split happened, each band member was supposed to receive £40,000 as their share of the accumulated wealth. None of them got a penny. Chandler traveled to the Bahamas to find the bank Jeffrey claimed was holding their accounts. The bank had disappeared. Just gone. Whether it ever existed or was a fabrication, no one could say. The money was gone. Years of work, millions in sales, and the band members walked away with nothing. The peak had become a trap. And the fall was just beginning. Eric Burdon wasn't ready to let go. In December 1966, while the original Animals were collapsing, Burdon assembled a new lineup under the name Eric Burdon and the Animals. He brought in John Weider on guitar, Vic Briggs on guitar, Danny McCulloch on bass, and kept Barry Jenkins on drums. It was a completely different band. Only Burdon and Jenkins had any connection to the original group. And it was a completely different sound. Burdon moved the band to California and reinvented them as a psychedelic, progressive rock act. They were no longer gritty British blues rockers. They were hippies, flower children, part of the San Francisco counterculture. They played the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, sharing a stage with Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who. The new Animals had hits. San Franciscan Nights peaked at number 9 in the US, number 7 in the UK, and number 1 in Canada in 1967. Sky Pilot, an anti-war epic released in 1968, hit number 14 in the US and number 7 in Canada. The song was so long, over 7 minutes, that it had to be split across both sides of a 45 revolutions per minute single. Listeners had to flip the record over mid-song. For a moment, it looked like Burdon had pulled off a miracle. The Animals were reborn. But the chaos wasn't over. In April 1968, Zoot Money joined as organist. In July 1968, Vic Briggs was replaced by Andy Summers, yes, the future guitarist of the Police. The lineup kept shifting, unstable, searching for something that couldn't be found. And then came Japan. In September 1968, Eric Burdon and the Animals were scheduled to tour Japan. But visa problems delayed the tour until November. When they finally arrived, they discovered the promoters, who the band didn't know were Yakuza, Japanese organized crime, were furious. The delay had cost them money, and the Yakuza wanted payback. They kidnapped the band's manager. They held him at gunpoint and demanded he sign an IOU for $25,000 to cover their losses. The manager, terrified, signed it, but added a note that the IOU was written under duress, knowing his captors couldn't read English. It didn't matter. The Yakuza gave the band an ultimatum: leave Japan the next day, or be killed. The Animals fled the country immediately, abandoning all their tour equipment in Japan. Instruments, amps, everything, left behind in a panicked escape. When they returned to the States, broken and traumatized, the band fell apart. By December 1968, Eric Burdon and the Animals had dissolved. The second incarnation was dead. Burdon would go on to join forces with the funk band War in 1970, scoring a hit with Spill the Wine. But the Animals, as a functioning entity, were finished. The lowest moment wasn't a single show or a public disaster. It was the slow realization that everything they'd built, twice, had been stolen, squandered, or destroyed. The original members had lost their money to a crooked manager. The new lineup had been held at gunpoint and run out of a country. There was no coming back from this. The members scattered. Eric Burdon went to California and teamed up with War, a funk band that gave him a brief second wind. Spill the Wine became a hit in 1970, but Burdon's drug use and erratic behavior eventually burned that bridge too. He spent the next decades as a solo artist, touring small clubs, chasing the ghost of his former fame. Chas Chandler quit the music industry as a performer and became a manager. And he discovered someone who would change rock history: Jimi Hendrix. Chandler saw Hendrix playing in a New York club, brought him to London, and shaped him into a star. It was Chandler who suggested Hendrix set his guitar on fire at Monterey. Chandler produced Hendrix's early albums. In many ways, Chandler had more success as a manager than he ever did as a musician. Alan Price, the man who walked away with the royalties, thrived. The Alan Price set became a respected band. Price had a solo career, appeared on TV, and lived comfortably off the fortune from House of the Rising Sun. He never apologized. Hilton Valentine, John Steele, and Dave Roberry drifted into obscurity. They played small gigs, session work, and struggled to rebuild careers that had been destroyed by bad management and betrayal. For years, the original Animals didn't speak to each other. Then, in December 1968, the same month the second incarnation of the band collapsed, the 5 original members reunited for a single benefit concert in Newcastle. It was a brief moment of healing, a nostalgic return to where it all began. But the story wasn't over. In late 1975, The original lineup decided to reform and record again. They released an album in 1977 titled "Before We Were So Rudely Interrupted," a darkly humorous reference to their abrupt collapse a decade earlier. The album was modest, the tour small, but it felt like closure. Then, in 1983, all 5 original members reunited again for a full album, arc, and a world concert tour. For fans who'd grown up with House of the Rising Sun, it was a miracle. The Animals were back. But nostalgia couldn't erase the damage. Offstage, the resentment remained. Alan Price still owned the royalties. The others still felt betrayed. Chas Chandler, in interviews, couldn't hide his bitterness. The reunion was professional, not personal. They played the hits, smiled for the cameras, and went their separate ways. And then came the ultimate validation and the ultimate insult. In 1994, the Animals were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It should have been a celebration. The 5 original members, Eric Burdon, Alan Price, Hilton Valentine, Chas Chandler, and John Steele, had earned their place in history. They'd created some of the most iconic music of the 1960s, sold millions of records, and influenced countless artists. But Eric Burdon didn't show up. He had a gig booked in Dusseldorf, Germany, and refused to cancel it. Whether it was ego, stubbornness, or lingering resentment, Burdon chose a small club performance over his own Hall of Fame induction. The other 4 members accepted the honor without him. It was a perfect metaphor for the Animals. Even in their greatest moment of recognition, they couldn't stand together. The legacy war didn't end there. In 2003, House of the Rising Sun was ranked number 123 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. In 2011, We Gotta Get Out of This Place was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. The accolades kept coming, but so did the legal battles. Who owned the name, The Animals? Who had the right to tour under it? Who controlled the catalog? For decades, various lineups toured as The Animals, or Eric Burdon's Animals, or The Original Animals. Fans were confused. The members were angry. The lawyers got rich. And then the fractures became permanent. Chas Chandler died in his sleep from a heart attack in 1996. He was only 57. The man who discovered Jimi Hendrix, who anchored the Animals through their rise and fall, was gone. He died without ever receiving the money he was owed from the band's peak years. Dave Roberry, the keyboardist who replaced Alan Price, died of heart failure in 2003. Hilton Valentine, the guitarist whose arpeggios defined House of the Rising Sun, died in 2021 at age 77. One by one, the men who built the Animals were disappearing, and the questions remained unanswered. Did Alan Price steal from his bandmates, or was he just the only one smart enough to protect himself? Was Mike Jeffrey a criminal, or just a ruthless businessman playing by the rules of the industry? Could the Animals have survived if they'd had better contracts, better lawyers, better luck? The answers don't matter anymore. The damage is irreversible. Decades later, the surviving members were still at war, not with violence, but with silence. They refused to speak. They refused to reconcile. The brotherhood that once created magic in a Newcastle club had become a graveyard of bitterness and regret. Today, Eric Burdon still tours. At over 80 years old, he performs House of the Rising Sun for audiences who weren't even born when it first topped the charts. He tells stories about the old days, about the chaos and the magic, but he doesn't talk much about the other members. John Steele, the last surviving original member besides Burdon, has largely retired from public life. Alan Price, who walked away with the royalties that destroyed the band's unity, passed away in 2021. He never publicly apologized. He never gave back the money. And to his credit, or his shame, he never pretended the situation was fair. The Animals catalog continues to generate millions in royalties. House of the Rising Sun has been covered over 1,000 times, streamed billions of times, and remains a staple of classic rock radio. The song outlived the band, outlived the resentment, outlived almost everyone who created it. And that's the ultimate tragedy. The Animals made music that will last forever, but the men who made it couldn't survive success. They created a legacy of rebellion, working-class pride, and raw emotional power, and then watched as the music industry, bad management, and their own human flaws tore it all apart. This is the story of how a 4-minute folk song became both a miracle and a curse. How 5 kids from Newcastle conquered the world and lost everything. How brotherhood turned to betrayal, and how a band that defined an era couldn't even stand on the same stage by the end. Success created legends, but it also created enemies. The Animals rose higher than they ever dreamed. And when they fell alone. What part of this story hits you the hardest? The betrayal over the royalties? The Yakuza kidnapping in Japan? The fact that Eric Burdon skipped his own Hall of Fame induction? Did you ever see the Animals live? Do you think they could have survived with better management? Or was the collapse inevitable? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about bands that conquered the world and then destroyed themselves, hit that subscribe button, because rock history is full of them. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.